G'day there. You're watching the Aussie BIM Guru, and today I've got a tutorial which is on a relatively complex topic that I've covered to some degree in the past, and that is bulk replacing family parameters using Dynamo. So I do have a video in the past I made on this topic using some custom nodes. It's a little bit out of date now, and it didn't work in bulk across multiple families. Now, I'll be honest, this workflow isn't one I usually like to share because people often use it to work with my own content that I sell and replace parameters with their own, but it's up to you. I decided to put it out there because it's more valuable in public than it is me hiding behind my own reservations. So this workflow will take a bunch of families in a Windows directory, so not online or OneDrive. Some will have family parameters, some will have shared parameters, some will have both that we want to replace. And we're going to use an Excel file in order to guide the replacement with intended shared parameters by name. It's going to be a lot more thorough versus my old video, but I will be using some custom nodes from my package called Crumple that you will need just to save some time where Python could be used. All my custom nodes have Python in them, so it's not like you can't see how to do the whole thing in Python if you want to, but hopefully it saves a bit of time in not covering every single step in Python. So today I will be using Autodesk Revit. I'll be using 2020. There is some API differences with parameter types, in this case parameter groups versus forge types. So if you are using Revit 2023, this workflow won't quite work the same way. You will need to do some research on forge types for parameters instead of parameter groups. I will be using Dynamo for Revit, of course, the built-in version to Revit, given I'm in 2020. And I'll also be using the Crumple package for some custom nodes along the way. There'll be some assumed knowledge. Hopefully you know how families work in Revit and you know how to use Dynamo, because we'll be skipping over the fundamentals. As well as this, you'll need to know some Python syntax. In particular, we'll be using a lot of zip loops today, so if you don't know about zip iteration, definitely look that up first and learn a little bit about what it means. Effectively, it's looping through multiple lists at the same time in parallel. As well as this, I'll be using some Revit API. I will cover some of the family document related API as I go, so don't worry if you're not completely up to date on family document API. We'll be mostly working with the family manager class today, which I will cover in a fair bit of depth. But without further ado, we'll jump straight in. If I talk too fast, feel free to slow down the video's playback speed so that I'm a little bit easier to understand, but hopefully you enjoy this video. So let's dive in. So before we dive into Dynamo, let's have a look at the setup that we'll be working with. So first of all, you're going to need a few things in this workflow. To begin with, you are going to need an Excel file. And we're going to be using two columns in Excel, effectively the name of the parameter we're looking for, and also the name of the parameter we'd like to replace it with. Noting that all the replacement parameters in this workflow are shared parameters. Generally, it wouldn't typically make sense to rename family parameters in my opinion because they serve a lot less purpose, whereas generally switching family parameters to shared parameters or swapping shared parameters with other shared parameters is a much more useful use case. In this case, I have a mixture of family parameters and shared parameters that I'm looking for, so this workflow will support both. So we're going to want that, and we're also going to be using a shared parameter file. So in this case, the shared parameter file will need all parameters that we want to actually replace. So in this case, these are all our new parameters, parameter 1, 1A, 2, 2A, 3, 3A, etc. So you're going to need to make sure you're connected to the shared parameter file so that Dynamo can actually access these definitions when we look for them. As well as this, I also just have a small set of families that I'm going to be working with. Now, using workflows with families is very difficult to troubleshoot in Dynamo because effectively you're going to want to open and close the families in a single process rather than just troubleshoot one step at a time, which can be pretty annoying when you're really just trying to work with the families. So what I'm going to probably do is just make a copy, and I'm just going to call this working. And this will contain a set of families we can temporarily leave open in the background, but we're going to want to reboot Revit eventually to make sure that all the background open files have been closed. So these families are all effectively the same. In their type properties, they have a mixture of parameters we're looking to replace. So family parameter 1, 2, 3, old parameter 1, 2, 3. This workflow will work with the assumption that not all these parameters may be present in the family. You might just have a few. So we're firstly going to have to filter down to find out which of these parameters are present inside each of these families as it runs. And then finally, we're going to actually replace them with their matching intended parameter. So I'm just going to close this family because you're going to want to make sure that you're not really pointing to these families while they're open in the same document because we're working in bulk here. So I'm going to begin by booting up Dynamo and just setting up the basic infrastructure for the script. We're going to use a mixture of Python, some custom nodes with Python in them, and then also just some basic nodes as well. So the first thing we're going to do is process our Excel file. So I'm going to get a file path input. Now you can use the default Excel node from Dynamo, but I find it has a lot of issues. So I actually have my own Excel import node in Crumple that is usually a lot more stable in my experience. I'm going to switch to manual mode, and I'm just going to note here that the tab that I'm working with in this case is sheet 1. So by default, my node does assume that the worksheet is sheet 1 unless you specify it. So for now, I'm just going to browse to this Excel file. My Excel node is a little bit slower than the typical one, but it should still work pretty reliably. Oh, there's my cat. And there we go. We can see we're reading in rows currently. So I'm also going to drop and transpose these rows. So we can do that with just 2 simple steps. I can do a rest of items node, which drops the first item from a list. And then I can transpose. And we're going to want to index both of these things in this case. So now you can see I've got my parameters before and my parameters after without the headers. So I'm just going to split these up into 2 branches using a code block with the XOX1 syntax. And now each of these pathways will be separated for use. I'm just going to save the script as well, just so I don't lose it. We're also going to want to get our corresponding shared parameters for those names in Excel. So I'll just say get Excel data, because at the moment we're just dealing with strings or text. These aren't actually parameters in Revit. So for this, I'm going to use a node from Crumple called shared parameters flat, which will output the definitions, the names, and the group properties of the parameters in my current connected shared parameter file. So we should see now we'll get lists with our definition and our name for our parameters, and this is enough for us to get the corresponding actual definition from our shared parameter file based on our Excel data. So I'm going to want to use an index of node to find out where these actual parameters are. So I'm going to say in this list of parameter names, where does each of these names from Excel as a new parameter sit? And I can see I get the corresponding index in my shared parameter file, which I can then feed into a get item at index node for the relative definition in the same position. And now you can see I've turned those Excel names into definitions instead. So I'm just going to keep this little block here as a separate one again. And I'm just going to call this get new definitions. So these are probably the easiest parts of the workflow covered. It gets a little bit harder from here because now we're going to start working with family documents. So I'm going to need to point to a directory path. And in this case, I'm going to point to this working directory that we created with those 5 families in it. And I'm also just going to use a node from Crumple, but you can use the default directory path node. I find mine just a little bit easier to work with. In this case, I'm going to search for anything with the string.rfa in its name, and I'm going to say false for deep search. So we're not searching any deeper than the root directory that we're providing. So if you wanted to work across a whole library of family documents, you could. In this case, I'm going to go family doc.open and get a node from Crumple, and this will just take these file paths and open them up one by one. And before I do this, the next step I'm going to want to do with this family document open is I'm firstly going to use it later. So I'm going to create a node in code block where I'll just call it relay. And its intention is just to really pass this later on to our script. So I'm just separating this for now. We're also going to want to get the family document parameters so we can find out which parameters need to be replaced. And in this case, I'm going to make sure that I apply this at level 1. I want to run this across every family document in the list, and I'm going to change the custom node lacing to longest. So that's going to give us a list of parameters in each of those. So what I'm going to do is just arrange it like this. This block deals with opening the family documents. And we're also going to get the parameters as well. Okay, so now we're going to get onto some more complicated parts. We're going to deal with Python. So I believe at this point I should be able to open these documents in the background, and then we'll need to go back and close Revit eventually to run the workflow completely, but I should be able to hold these documents in a background state. So I'm going to hit run. So at this point we're going to get a few things happening. We're going to get our corresponding definitions, and we're going to get lists of the names and properties of parameters in these family documents, which we should have now. So we're going to be dealing both with the parameters as elements as well as the names of those parameters in order to match them to our Excel data that we have originally. So we're going to open up a Python script now. I will be using a Python script with 4 inputs, and in this case it's going to be using my custom boilerplate that I use by default, which you can find over on my GitHub. So we're going to get a few inputs here. We're firstly going to get the elements, which in this case are the parameters in the family documents, which is going to be a list of lists of parameters and also their names as the second input. The third input is going to be the old parameter name, and the fourth input is going to be the new parameter definition to replace that with. So the purpose of this Python script is basically to work through each list of parameters in the families and find out which of the target parameters exist. If we find them, we're going to create new lists for each family, which are going to contain both the new parameter definitions and also the parameters to replace. So we're effectively filtering down the parameters at this point. So what I'll call this Python script is filter and get parameters / definitions. So we're going to boot up this Python script, and I've just got a reference in the background I'll be looking at. If you see my eyes looking over the side of the screen, it's because I'm looking at my reference. So generally we're not going to need too much of our boilerplate in this case. I believe we should only need, in this case, probably actually none of the Revit API related aspects of Python here. I think we only need raw Python in this case. We're dealing with basically just objects and strings. So I believe I can actually just get rid of everything and just go from the inputs onwards. Great. So we're now going to start declaring our inputs. I might just copy some of these things because it's faster, but we're going to create 4 inputs here. The parameter lists and the parameter names, the names that we're checking for, and the new definitions that line up to those checking names. So those 4 inputs that we provided at the start. Now I might actually just probably copy this block of text in here rather than typing it out manually, because this is really not as crucial as the next step of the process, but I'll explain it in detail. You'll be able to get this in the sample script if you want, but effectively I'm just going to call this my core body of code, and finally our outputs as well. So what we're doing here is declaring 2 inputs in a zip iteration loop. We're going to be looping across our list of parameter lists and our list of parameter names. So while we're looping across these, effectively we're working across each of those lists for each family. So we're looping across lists at this point. We're now going to create 2 new lists for each of those families, one for the parameters we want to send forward and one for the definitions we want to replace them with. So for each family, we're going to create 2 sublists. We're now saying for each parameter and each name in the list of parameters and the list of names, we're then going to loop inside here using another zip loop across the names that we're checking for and the definitions that they line up to. So we're saying for each name that we're checking for and the definition that lines up to it across each parameter name and parameter in the family document. We're saying if the name that we're checking for is equal to the name of the parameter that we're finding, then we're actually going to, in this case, append that parameter to this sublist for that family. We're also going to append the definition to the definitions list. And this will end up giving us 2 sublists per family that contain both a list of the parameters to replace as objects and then the definition to replace them with. Finally, we're going to append that list and the other list to a broader list structure, which will leave us with a list of lists that we can send forward in line with our family documents. So it's not the most complex Python script, it just relies on some nested loops in order to achieve a basic outcome, and we're really just using string matching in order to find what we want to send forward. So if I do run this, of course we're going to get an error. I think in this case I do need to actually just declare my 2 storage outputs, out parameters list and out definitions list. There we go. And we can see that now we're going to have of our first list, which contains all of our family parameters as sublists. And we can see in this case, every family has all 6, so it's found all 6. And then we also have all 6 definitions to replace them with. Now we could put this inside a broader piece of Python to take forward, but I find that this step is often quite crucial for troubleshooting, so I do prefer to separate this from the broader replacement portion of the script. This isn't really dealing with the Revit API, it's more so in this case really dealing with just filtering basic objects based on strings, so I find it a much easier block of Python to keep separate from the main piece of code that we're dealing with. So from this, we're going to want to re-index the outputs. So I'm going to say my parameters are equal to out0, so we're just going to call this output basically out, and we're going to say the definitions is equal to out1. And we can break these now into two outputs. Because it's a code block, we'll always see the last object that's indexed, which in this case is our definition list. Now at this point, we're really just going to be dealing with our actual family documents. So this is a little bit more complex, this step. I will run through this in more detail and explain what's happening as we go, and probably cross-reference the Revit API docs as we go as well. So I'm going to create a new Python script, and I'm going to make 3 inputs. My first input is going to be my family documents, which are currently held in the background, my parameters that I want to replace, and my definitions that I want to replace them with. Noting that we have a mixture of shared and non-shared family types at this point. I'm just going to block this up as well and say parameters and defs per family. And we'll just make that a little bit neater. And this step is really where most of the magic happens. This is actually where we're going to replace the parameters. And this is going to be a little bit more complex, so this is probably actually going to be the crux of the video. But we're just going to begin, in this case, from my boilerplate template. And we only need really the Revit API and the Revit services modules in this case. So I'm going to go right down to Revit services and keep the document manager and the transaction manager. I'm going to get rid of Revit API UI and also .ui because we don't need those. And in this case, we're not actually going to declare the current document because we're going to be transacting inside the family documents instead. So we're going to get our inputs, which in this case, I'm just going to paste in for ease. But I'm going to call them parameter lists and definition lists. And then also we need our documents. So I'm going to call that input docs. So unlike the usual doc, which we declare for the current document most typically as a variable, I'm now just going to be storing them as docs. And let's just neaten those equal signs up so it's easy to read. Okay, so I don't need my defining functions either. I'm not going to be using those. And really from here, we're just going to be working with a few different things. So the first thing we're going to do is figure out what we want to send out of our script. And in this case, we can probably just send our parameters forward. We could send our family document forward as well, I guess. It really just depends on what makes the most sense to send out of the document. I may actually send the family document forward because then we can just close it after this is finished. I don't usually do it that way, but now that I think about it, it probably makes more sense. So in this case, we probably actually don't need an output to append to, unless you want to put in like an error report to tell you what's happened. But in this case, I won't include an error report for now. So I'm going to want to firstly just do a few things. So one thing I'm going to want to do is temporarily rename any parameters to a new family parameter before I replace them with a shared parameter. And we're going to want to make sure that at that point in time, the name of that parameter is completely unique. And we can do that using a counter and a name to append the counter to. So for now, I'm just going to say that the counter is equal to 0. And we're just going to keep increasing that as we run through our families and their types. So, and their parameters. So we're going to do the main body of code. You can call this something more descriptive if you want. And we're going to be working across, firstly, our documents, our parameter list, and our definition list and we're going to use a zip loop here in docs. So we're working across each family document. We're going to also take I'll just paste it, it's easier. We're going to take our parameter lists and our definition lists. So in this case, we'll have basically a list of parameters, a list of definitions, and a document at this point. And you know what, I might potentially I'll make something to append things to. Actually, I'll make a parameter list just so the user can see what's happened as we go through, and we'll append the list of outcomes to it. So we're going to want to begin by making a new sublist. I'm going to say that the parameter lists that we're going to append to the output in this case, and this should be parameter lists, sorry, we're going to append sublists to it. And we're now going to work across our parameters and our definitions in the family document. So we can do a few things here. Firstly, we'll just say for parameter and definition in zip, and now we're going to work across the P list and the D list, which we're already zip looping across in relation to each family document. And I'm going to start a transaction, and we're going to want to start the transaction inside the family document. So I'm just going to call the transaction trans equals, and I'm now going to create a transaction in the family document, and I'll just call this replace parameters. And we're going to want to, at that point, start our transaction so Revit can work with it. And then we're going to want to also set the counter for naming the parameters. So I'm going to say, first of all, the counter is going up by 1. And then we're also going to turn it into a string so that we can add it to a name. So I'm going to say, in this case, string counter. So we're also going to have to firstly do two things. So we're going to be working here with what we call the family manager. So what I might do is just look at it in the Revit API, but I'll say get family manager and parameter settings. So I'm just going to say fm is equal to doc.family manager. So you're probably wondering at this point, what is the family manager? Well, it's really a special class in the Revit API that helps us do things to families. So rather than everything being separate, disconnected methods and classes and properties, Autodesk decided instead to give us one unifying class to do things to families, especially when it comes to parameters and types. So we can do a lot of things here. For example, we can rename family parameters. This is one method we'll be using. So to the family manager of the document, we can apply the rename parameter method, for example, and we give it a parameter, and we give it a name, and it will rename that particular parameter. More importantly, we also have the replace parameter method. Now, noting there are a few different ways to replace parameters. For example, we can replace a family parameter with a shared parameter. We can also replace shared family parameters with non-shared parameters. But how can we replace shared parameters with shared parameters? Well, the funny thing is we can't actually, but what we can do is replace a shared parameter with a family parameter, and then replace that temporary family parameter with a shared parameter. A bit strange, right? But we're going to take advantage of that in this case in order to replace all types of parameters with shared parameters. So we're actually in this case going to want to find out from these family parameters a few things. So I'm going to go to the family parameter class and we're going to want to find a few things out about this family parameter. We're going to want to know, is the family parameter shared, which we can find out as a property. We're also going to want to find out if it is an instance parameter, again, which is a property. And we're also going to want to get, in this case, what we call the parameter's definition. And from its definition, we can determine its parameter group, which will enable us to guide our parameter replacement method as well. So these are all pretty important steps. They're all properties that basically these methods we're going to use to replace the parameter ask for. So even though they may seem redundant because the parameter group is already implied by the parameter, in this case, we're going to tell the family again that we need to use these properties. So as well as the family manager, I'm also going to get the parameter group, which in this case is going to be from the parameter we're looping across, which is P. And I'm going to ask for its definition and then get its parameter group. I'm also going to ask for the parameter instance property. So I'm going to say is the parameter an instance parameter. We can also ask if the parameter is shared, but I'm just going to use that as an argument later in my script. So we're going to say if the parameter is shared, we're going to want to make it a family parameter. Replace with family. If not, then we rename it anyway, so that it temporarily has a name that won't clash with other parameters within the family itself. So I'm just going to save and reopen at that point so we don't lose our progress. And I'll also save my Dynamo script. So we're firstly going to want to say if the parameter, and we're going to use the isShared property. So if it's true, we're going to want to replace our shared parameter with a family parameter. So if we go back to that method, so if I find the family manager class again and look at its methods, we're going to look at the replace parameter method. And in this case, we're going to want to replace a shared family parameter with a non-shared family parameter. You can use either the forge type ID in 2023 onwards, or we're going to use in this case the built-in parameter group. So noting this workflow may not work perfectly in 2023, but at this point what we're going to provide is firstly the family parameter, which we have, the string, which will be a temporary name, the built-in parameter group, which we have, and also the is instance property, which we have as well. So let's set this up. So I'm going to say if it is shared, I'm going to say the parameter is just going to be passed to itself again. We're going to keep parameter as p. I'm going to call on the family manager, which I've stored to a variable called fm. And we're going to do replace parameter. So we're replacing p. And we're going to replace it with a name of temporary plus the counter. And I'll just put a space after that. So at this point, we're going to use the string counter. So that will create a unique name within the context of running the script, hopefully. As long as you don't use parameters called temporary 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, etc. We're then going to specify the parameter group and is it an instance, which we have available as parameters. And at this point, our shared parameter, if it is shared, will become a temporarily renamed family parameter. Now, if it's not shared, then we know it's a family parameter. So in this case, we're going to want to rename the parameter instead. And this is a much more simple approach. So what we can actually do is probably actually just make a temporary family name here because we're going to use it twice. So I'll just make a new parameter called temp name and make it that. And we're going to use this in the rename step as well. So it makes more sense to make it a variable just to make the script more legible. And in this case, we're just going to rename the parameter. The parameter will effectively stay itself. So I'm going to say fm rename parameter, so family manager, and I'm just going to do p, and I'm going to do temp name. And that's all we need for that method. It's very straightforward. At this step, we can now replace the parameter with the intended shared parameter. And we know at this point that the parameter has to be a family parameter, so we can reliably use a method across this. So now we're going to replace family parameter with shared parameter. So I'm going to say the shared parameter, which we'll call a new variable, shp, is family manager. And again, we're going to use the replace parameter method. But in this case, we're going to provide a few different things. So the replace parameter method for a shared parameter from a family parameter is a little bit different. So we provide the family parameter, which we have, the definition, which we're looping across right now, and then the parameter group, and is it an instance? So in this case, I can say p, d, pg, pi. 4 arguments are available. And finally at the end, assuming this has all worked, we can take our original list that we made, param list out, and we can just append the shared parameter element to this. Now, if you know this may not sometimes work, you can always use a try except and build an error report. It's up to you. In this case, I'm pretty confident it's going to work, so I'm just going to go without an error report. Now that we've finished this transaction in our family at this point, we can close that transaction at the moment. And I found that I do have to actually create a transaction for each of these steps. Otherwise, you will get some errors relating to transactions occurring in different documents. There's some sub-transaction classes you can use as well, which is probably a cleaner way of doing this, opening a transaction within the family document and handling these within separate sub-transactions. But for now, I am just going to work with transactions because I found it's a little bit easier, but probably not as efficient. And I have found that I do have to both commit the transaction, and I find sometimes you also need to force close the transaction as well. For some reason, it seems like this is always a bit of a challenge. So usually I also call on the transaction manager and the instance of the transaction, and I use the force close transaction. Now I'll just make sure I've got the spelling right here. Transaction manager dot instance. I'm pretty sure the spelling is right there. I can almost guarantee I'm going to get something wrong. I might just copy this line because I don't trust me typing these words out. But it should be transaction manager.instance.force close transaction. There we go. And after we've finished looping on the one family, we can then take the param lists out, which we've got back here, and just append our list of parameters to it for each family document. So our output is in that structure. Now we can also potentially send out the family documents as well if we want to. In fact, maybe we will do that. So in this case, I'm going to send out two things in a list. I'm going to send the param lists out, and I'm also going to send the family documents output as well. So that we can now take that and then also close the documents after we're finished using the output to make sure it happens after everything else. So this should work. I am just going to go blind and hopefully it will run correctly. But at this point, we can now take out 0, out 1, and we know that the first of these is going to sort of be like a report of the parameters created. So I can make this an output and say parameters created, and then I can also carry my family documents forward. So in this case, we don't actually need a wait for node anymore. So I can probably actually just bypass my relay, because this waits for this, and then everything else waits for this. So I'll leave my output just down here. And once we're finished, we can close our family document. So I'm going to use the family doc.close node here. And we're going to want to save these as well. So I'm going to provide, in this case, a true output to save these documents as well. And at this point, we should hopefully have a successful script. So I'm just going to group these up. And I think I might be able to actually run this while the documents are open. And we should hopefully see the workflow work. But we should be able to also run this from start to finish in a single run. For now, I'm just going to try it and see what happens. Okay, of course we get an error. Family parameter object has no attribute instance, line 45. I think that's meant to be is instance. I'm pretty sure that's the error that I've made there. Yes, it's meant to be is instance. There we go. So we can see the parameters are replaced. The family documents were not closed, so I'm wondering if maybe there's a reason that happened. I might run it completely in one cycle, but we'll just double check what's happened there. So these haven't been closed. Interesting. Maybe to be safe, I might actually relay over the top and use a pass-through. I don't think I have to, though. I really don't think I have to. So family document, in one, of course. That's probably why that happened. So I'm definitely going to close Revit and reopen it just to make sure those background documents are well and truly closed. And then we're going to actually run this properly. But I'm pretty confident this is going to work based on what I've seen. I think I've got it right. So it's a really powerful workflow. If you have a very large list of parameters you're trying to replace in lots of documents and you know the names you're looking for, this can be a very quick workflow. There is one key limitation to be aware of with replacing parameters, and as far as I know, you cannot work around this, and that is if you have any parameters associated on an instance basis to an object that is in the model as a component that supports associated parameters, you know, those little equal signs down the right side of a parameter. I believe you'll run into the same problem if it's in a group or an array, where it will try to ungroup the arrays, and generally the family manager will skip over these parameters and give you an error. So you won't be able to run this on any families that are using associated parameters on an instance basis to nested arrayed components. One workaround for that is to associate on a type basis to non-shared components, but it doesn't always work in every scenario. But otherwise, I think that's the only limitation that I'm aware of with this workflow. It's a very technical limitation. But people do use arrays quite a lot, so it can be a problem. Okay, so let's go back. We're pointing to our working file, pointing to our parameter list. We have it closed. Everything else looked like it should be okay. So family document should be the second output here, so I should now be doing that correctly. Docs, yes. So I'm confident this should work, hopefully. And I'll press run, and we should see these families hopefully open and close. We should see these backup files appear. There we go. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Excellent, no errors, fantastic. That is a very difficult workflow to get right, so I'm pretty relieved that worked. And let's just see what's happened. In table 1, we should now see that we have new parameter 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3a. So we can see that that's worked perfectly. And we can see this should have worked in every single family document, which is pretty cool. Perfect. And I believe if I take one of these and rerun this process, so if I take this before file, just make a copy, and let's say maybe one of them we just want to take out some parameters. I'm pretty sure they don't all have to be present for this workflow to work. So let's just leave family param 1, 2, 3 in this one. And let's also maybe leave old param 1, 2, 3 in this one. And let's leave a real mixture of parameters in table 5. Great. And I believe the script should be able to work with partial replacement. I'm going to take this folder and just call it working2. You will end up making a lot of copies of folders when you're testing family-related workflows like this, because every time you hit an error, all those family documents are stuck open in the background, generally, which is pretty annoying. So I'm going to point instead to working2. I'm going to run the same workflow, and I believe this should work. I think I've set this up so it filters out if there is no parameter. It doesn't take the definition or the parameter forward. Great. And we can see in this case, family 2, we swapped out 3, family 3, and 3. So it looks like it's worked perfectly in this case, which is fantastic. So if we just check those families, table 5 has worked with a mixture. Table 4 has worked with just one set, and table 2, I think it was, has worked with one set. So it's a very flexible workflow when you're dealing with using just shared parameters to replace both family and shared. So I hope this has been a useful workflow, a very complex one, but I hopefully taught you about the family manager. I will do some more Dynamo tutorials in future, but probably keep them a little bit more on the complicated side, some Python involved, some API involved, because that's really the point that I'm generally at with what I'm doing with Dynamo as well. I don't tend to work as much with custom nodes or without Python. So there we go, a really handy workflow. I hope you found it interesting. You can find all my stuff over on my GitHub, including the scripts and files for today in the Dynamo repo. So if you're not already following and subscribing, feel free to do so. And thanks for watching today. If you have any video or topic requests, feel free to let me know. I typically record a fair way in advance, as some people are finding out, so your topic request may come a few months later than you make it, but I will try to address all the ones that I think are relevant or suitable. I don't tend to cover the fundamentals much these days. I do recommend other channels for covering the basics, but if you have an advanced workflow for architecture in particular, I might be able to help. Anyway, like, comment, share, subscribe, all that good stuff, and I'll see you in the next video. Thanks. Take care. Bye.